30 minutes ago, Iranian cluster missiles struck the last functioning water treatment and desalination facility remaining in Israel's national water network. Not the first facility, not one of several, the last one. The single facility that has been carrying the entire weight of Israel's civilian water supply since earlier strikes took every other node of the Meccarat network offline. 4 million people in Tel Aviv, across the communities of the coastal plain, inside hospitals running on backup generators, and at emergency distribution points spread across the country were depending on this one facility as their only source of treated water. That dependency is now gone. What Iran chose to fire at this target matters as much as the target itself. These were not standard ballistic warheads. They were cluster munitions, a weapon system that functions in a fundamentally different way and produces a fundamentally different category of destruction. A ballistic warhead strikes a single point. It creates a crater, a defined blast radius, and structural damage that radiates outward with diminishing intensity. Against a large industrial facility, that means the components within the blast radius are destroyed, but the components outside it remain damaged and potentially repairable. The facility loses capacity, output drops, but partial operation remains possible because partial infrastructure remains intact. That is precisely why the earlier strikes against Meccarat infrastructure, which used standard ballistic warheads, produced a water crisis rather than a water absence. Some components survived. Some output continued. The last working facility has been sustaining reduced but real production by running whatever the earlier strikes left intact at maximum emergency capacity. Cluster munitions do not work that way. A cluster munition disperses hundreds of individual submunitions across a defined target area, each one an independent explosive device, each one detonating at a separate point across the entire facility footprint simultaneously. The intake pumps are hit, the pretreatment filtration systems are hit, the reverse osmosis membranes performing the actual desalination process are hit, the chemical dosing systems that make treated water safe for human consumption are hit. The high-pressure pumps moving product water into the distribution network are hit. The control and monitoring infrastructure coordinating every process stage is hit. Every system, every component, every piece of equipment the facility requires to function struck at the same moment by submunitions distributed across the entire target area. You cannot repair that by replacing one component, because replacing one reveals 3 others that are also destroyed. You restore those 3, and the control system coordinating them is gone. You restore the control system, and the intake infrastructure feeding the entire process is wrecked. Cluster munitions against an industrial target do not create a repair problem. They create a replacement problem. And replacing an entire water treatment and desalination facility, every system, every component, every piece of specialized industrial equipment on the timeline that 4 million people without any treated water source require is not an engineering challenge. It is an impossibility. This distinction between a water shortage and a water absence is the most important analytical frame for understanding what happens next. A water shortage is a condition where supply is insufficient to meet demand, where rationing and emergency distribution can manage the gap between what is available and what is needed. A water absence is a condition where there is no supply at all, where there is nothing to ration, where emergency distribution is not managing a gap between reduced supply and normal demand, but is attempting to substitute entirely for a supply that no longer exists. No emergency distribution system capable of substituting entirely for a major city's water infrastructure exists anywhere in the world as a prepositioned capability. It exists as a humanitarian response that gets mobilized over days and weeks after a disaster is identified. Israel does not have days and weeks in the biological sense. It has whatever water currently sits in pipes, in tanks, in bottles on shelves, and in whatever emergency reserves civil defense managed to preposition before the infrastructure came down. That supply is finite. When it is consumed, there is nothing behind it. The international humanitarian organizations equipped to respond to exactly this kind of crisis, the ICRC, UNICEF, the WHO, operate on logistics timelines measured in days from the moment a crisis is identified to the moment water trucking, purification units, and distribution infrastructure can become operational in a conflict zone. But this is a conflict zone with a destroyed airport. A conflict zone where alternative routing channels are already operating beyond their designed capacity on military logistics that take priority over humanitarian supply. The humanitarian water response that the international community will mobilize is not going to arrive on the timeline that 4 million people's biological requirements demand. It will arrive on the timeline that closed airports, active conflict, and an international logistics system never prepositioned for this specific scenario permits. Those 2 timelines are not the same timeline. The hospital system represents the most immediately critical dimension of this situation and deserves specific analytical attention separate from the broader civilian picture. Israel's hospitals were already running on backup generators after the power grid strike. They were already managing reduced water availability from the earlier Meccarat infrastructure damage. They were already operating at surge capacity from weeks of accumulated missile campaign casualties. The destruction of the last working water plant has removed the treated water supply that hospital clinical functions depend on at precisely the moment those hospitals are most dependent on every remaining input staying functional. Dialysis requires water meeting specific purity standards. Surgical sterilization requires water. Wound care and infection prevention standards requires water. The hospital system that was already under extreme stress is now operating without one of the foundational inputs that clinical medicine cannot function without. The Israeli government's public communication in the hours since the strike has followed the same pattern that characterized every previous infrastructure failure in this conflict. The civilian population has received no public acknowledgement of what cluster munitions specifically do to industrial infrastructure that a standard ballistic strike does not. No honest assessment of the restoration timeline has been communicated. No updated guidance has reached the 4 million people who were relying on this facility as their single remaining source of treated water this morning. The civil defense guidance telling civilians to maintain emergency water reserves was issued at the start of the conflict, when those reserves could still be replenished from a functioning supply. It has not been updated to reflect a situation where there is no supply from which anything can be replenished. The civilians who consumed their emergency reserves in the days following the earlier water infrastructure strikes, expecting restoration on the timeline their government was implying, have nothing. The civilians who maintain their reserves are living on a finite quantity with no replenishment available. Neither group has been told what the honest answer to the question of when the water comes back actually is. The geopolitical dimension of Iran's weapon choice is generating responses that go beyond the strategic analysis of the strike itself. Cluster munitions are subject to international humanitarian law restrictions under the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Iran is not a signatory, but the use of cluster munitions against civilian water infrastructure in a densely populated conflict zone has produced responses that frame the event in humanitarian law terms regardless. The ICRC has characterized the strike as a potential violation of the prohibition against attacks on objects indispensable to civilian survival under Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions. The United Nations Secretary General has called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire specifically to allow emergency water distribution to reach Israel's civilian population. And the allied governments that have been managing domestic public support for Israel's position throughout this conflict are now operating in a public opinion environment where the story is no longer about military strikes, military targets. It is about cluster missiles and the last water plant. That is a story no allied government can defend on the same terms it has been using. What the destruction of Israel's last working water plant ultimately forces into view is not a military question or even a strategic one. It is a question about the relationship between infrastructure and survival in a modern urban society, and about the timeline on which that relationship operates when the infrastructure is gone. Power, water, airport connectivity, each has been removed. Each has been removed in a way that the remaining mechanisms for restoration cannot address on the timeline that 9 million people's daily existence requires. The clock that started running the moment those cluster munitions detonated is not operating on the weeks and months that military campaigns are typically measured in. It is operating on the days that human biology allows. And every decision by the Israeli government, by Iran, by allied governments watching from outside, is now being made in the shadow of that timeline, whether those making the decisions acknowledge it openly or not.